Welcome to Ladies Talking Love, Season 2, Episode 7, Creating a Safe Space for Emotional Intimacy. It's Ladies Talking Love, a community of women uncovering more joy and fulfillment in sex as we learn from experts and amazing women like you. Together, let's create a world where women's sexuality is celebrated and understood, beginning with our own. I'm your host, Ariel Finlinson. Let's talk love. I don't know if there's a more perfect episode for us to kick off the week of Thanksgiving. In this episode, we talk about creating a safe place in your relationship to increase your intimacy, sexually, but especially emotionally. And I know for me, especially with the holiday season, things can get so busy that sometimes I don't take as much time as I would like to slow down and really connect and listen to my partner. I hope that this episode will give you some encouragement, but also some really accessible tips about how to be able to start creating more intimacy in your relationship, whether you already are feeling connected or maybe you're in a space where you're not feeling as connected as you would like to be. In this episode with Tammy Hill, she also shares a beautiful story about her and her late husband. And I hope that you make it through to listen to the end for it because it almost made me cry. It was just so beautiful and really illustrated a lot of the points that we wanted to get across in this episode. Tammy Hill is a mother, stepmother, grandmother, marriage and family therapist, and a professor in the School of Family Life at Brigham Young University. As a professor, she enjoys teaching hundreds of students each semester about marriage preparation, marriage enhancement, and healthy sexuality in marriage. She also has a private therapy practice where she works extensively with couples striving for sexual wholeness in marriage. Before jumping in, I just want to thank you so much for being here. I have loved being on this journey with you and learning with you, and especially for Thanksgiving week. I just really hope you know how grateful I am for you joining along in the podcast, joining me on Instagram as we talk more about the episodes, and giving yourself space to learn about sexuality with me. I really appreciate you so much, and I hope that you have an awesome Thanksgiving week. I'm excited to have Tammy Hill on Ladies Talking Love today. Thanks for joining me, Tammy.
Thank you, Ariel. I appreciate you inviting me.
One thing that Tammy does is she works a lot with religious couples and looking at some of the cultures that we have in our religion that may affect our sexuality. So I'd love for you to start off talking about what are some of the harmful ideas that are sometimes inherited in religious cultures around sexuality?
Well, I think in really strict religious cultures, it seems like girls need to be the gatekeepers of the sexuality, that you control how far you go in the relationship. You control what boys are thinking about by the way you dress, which I think is so unhealthy on so many levels. This is a relationship and you're both accountable for your own behavior. And one shouldn't need to be responsible for the behavior or the thinking of another. You can't control someone else's thinking. In my culture growing up, modesty was taught so much that it is what I did or didn't do to help boys control their thinking about sexuality. And I don't think modesty has much to do with do's or don'ts. I believe it's more about a condition of your heart, how you respect yourself, and also your kindness to others who are around you and what they might be feeling, but not doing it as a way to control how other people are viewing you, or that you're somehow making it so men don't have sexual thoughts.
How have you seen those types of ideas, especially looking at the gatekeeper? I'm glad you brought that up. This feeling that religious women may feel like I have to be the one to stop the forward progress of sexuality because the male is going to go as far as he can. And so I have to rein it in. And with modesty as well. I'm really glad you brought that up too. Just sometimes in religious cultures, we're taught that the way I dress determines how other people act. When in reality, we're all in charge of our own actions and what we do with the things that come into our heads. So, what are some things that you've seen that have affected women, especially negatively, looking at these different cultures you mentioned?
Well, I think one thing, it creates fear that if I am going to do something or not do something, it's going to cause something else to happen that's unwanted. And so then women sometimes feel afraid about their sexuality. They don't feel like they own their sexuality, but that their sexuality is for their future husband or their husband. So to me, they're obviously disassociating from the sexual part of who they are, and that's unhealthy. Erotic energy is so creative and so beautiful, and to be able to grasp and hold on to your sexual piece and radiate the energy that comes from it in doing good and propelling yourself forward into becoming, I think you miss out a lot on that wonderful creative energy that desire and sexuality bring to your soul.
Yeah. And I can totally relate with so much of this because I grew up in a very fear based
Mhm.
beliefs around sexuality. And so a lot of these cultural beliefs that I grew up with really affected my ability to see sexuality as something good. And instead, I was so fearful that it was uncontrollable. So I had to suppress it so much so that it didn't
Right.
take control of me or take control of the men around me because I felt like I was in charge of kind of helping them not have sexual thoughts or feelings. And so I'm so glad we bring this up because it can really affect, I think, women's ability to understand that they are sexual and that that's good and okay. And it brings in so much fear. So, what are some of the ways we can kind of shift these beliefs, especially around dress codes that have been translated into modesty and about these kind of fears, gatekeeping beliefs? How can we kind of shift those, especially if we're in a marriage already and we're like, oh no, these are affecting me. I'm suppressing my sexuality.
So, integrity, if you think of the word of integrity, it comes from the root word of integer, which is parts. And part of each of us is a sexual piece. And when we integrate our sexual part to all of us, we're living with integrity. We're bringing this part of ourselves rather than pushing it away and feeling afraid or ashamed of it or just exploiting it, not caring. We each of us are born with a capacity to be sexual. And when you have sexual thoughts, sexual feelings, physiological responses to those, which sexual arousal, instead of being afraid of that, embrace that as part of the human experience and relish the fact that you are responsive and that with that comes, like I was saying earlier, that eros energy is a wonderful energy that does propel us forward, is creative, and you can utilize that energy before marriage in ways that feel congruent to you, not being afraid of this piece of ourselves. And maybe some mindfulness work could be really helpful with that. Realizing that growth happens when we choose to leave our comfort zones and lean into things that might be a little uncomfortable. So, if the idea of being sexual and accepting that part of yourself is uncomfortable, lean into the anxiety of it, accept that you're going to come out on the other side stronger and more whole than you are moving in. Deep breathing is a wonderful way to gap the brain and the heart. And for your brain to be going crazy, thinking, this is wrong, this is bad. And yet in the heart, you have this energy and your body's responding to it. I think it's really important to do that deep breathing and tell yourself a mantra. I'm a sexual being. This is a good thing. Sex is a good thing. It's part of the human experience. It propels me forward to be a better human. Whatever our mantra is, doing the deep breath work and reciting the mantra in our head, I think can be really helpful in moving from being afraid to embracing this part of ourselves.
I'm really glad that you brought up mindfulness. We actually have a whole episode with Dr. Levitt, who's done a lot of research.
Oh, I love Shalom. She's awesome.
She is so great on sexual mindfulness. And I was actually just got to be with her this last weekend and just thinking about the idea of being able to slow down sexual encounters. And like you were saying, take time to breathe, take time to just really be present, have a mantra. I was just doing an interview with some girls who had suffered sexual abuse and assault earlier in their life. And they talked about mantras, I'm safe, this is okay. And just how helpful those can be to kind of learn to feel what's happening in our bodies.
Let me just go back and address a little something about mindfulness. It's not only to help you work through the fear of that this is a good thing, but I think a lot of times as women, we also have checklists of we need to do this, 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 and this before I can relax and make love. So it's kind of on both sides. We need to bring a mantra. My mantra is to bring my head to bed. I don't have a hard time. I don't feel shame or any of that, afraid of my sexuality, but I have to put away my to-do list in order to really come and immerse myself in the moment with my husband. And to have the discipline in my mind to do that is important.
I like that. Bring your head to bed. So what are some other tips you may give for women listening who are like, but I don't even know what that feels like because I've suppressed my sexuality so much. Like, where do I even begin to start to kind of uncover my sexuality and make it my own?
I think learning all about the different erogenous zones on your body is important. You can do this alone if you want, or you can do it with your spouse if you want. Discovering different parts of your body and how they feel good. Primary erogenous zones are your mouth and lips, your breasts and nipples, and your genitals. There are a lot of secondary and even more tertiary erogenous zones, and learning how to touch different types of touch. Maybe you like light feathery touch or more of a firm hand or wet touch. Whatever the type of touch you like in all of the different ways that and places on your body, I think being really aware and mindful as you're learning what you like and you're letting yourself receive pleasure in a way that you like it, and then you can communicate this with your partner and share this exploration together. So that's a way to do it. I think putting your mind around the idea of doing it. Personally, I don't think behavior modification, if your heart's not involved in that, it's no good.
Yeah.
It's not going to work. So get your heart right. If you need to really study and be prayerful about accepting the idea that you're sexual, do the work you need to do to get your heart in the right place. And once you start feeling congruent that this is really how I was created, this really is a good part of my experience. Once the heart is there, then I think the mind will show up, and you don't need to worry so much about what you should or shouldn't do. You just need to be in the moment and receive and give pleasure.
What are some tips for couples working on this? Because especially for the female partner, if she hasn't been able to find her sexuality or really embrace it, this makes a total shift in the dynamic of a relationship that has maybe already been created, of maybe a husband feeling like, I'm a good lover, I know what she likes. And that might just be because she hasn't shared, or maybe he realizes there's some things going on, but he doesn't know how to help. How can you with your spouse kind of create a safe place to do maybe some of this personal exploration, some together, just to kind of keep it open and safe in this exploration of something new for you?
I like the word sexploration. That's a good one. Well, I think creating time, having the communication together that this is a priority in our relationship. This is something we want to progress and develop together. And so I think creating time to have those opportunities to go slow, to be mindful in the moment with your touch, as like I was describing that as you were learning all the different places that feel really nice. A lot of times we focus on those primary erogenous zones, and there's a lot of the body that isn't ever incorporated into the sexual touch. And so I think that requires time, Ariel. I think couples need to make this a priority and put down a 2-hour window every week that you can on your calendar, and then safeguard that time to explore and talk and discover a lot about each other in a real humble and loving way. Emotional connection is going to really help this happen. So if a woman doesn't feel emotionally connected with her husband, the likelihood of her wanting to do something like this isn't going to be great.
Yeah.
And so working to be in a place emotionally where you're feeling you can trust each other, that you're really being understood by your partner, and you're understanding your partner, getting in a good spot emotionally will really help, especially the woman, to move forward in the discovery of different parts of her that are designed for pleasure.
And what if we are maybe on the other side? What if our husband is feeling a lot of shame around his sexuality because of the same modesty culture that we talked about, gatekeeper? I think sometimes a lot of men may feel shame as well, like, oh, I can't control this because the girls have to dress modestly for me, this message that has been portrayed. What are some ways as a partner or wife that we could support our husband?
I think it's pretty much the same both ways, that you reassure that this is a good thing, that this is something that is created for us to enjoy. I think having the husband do the work he needs to do to get his heart on board, like the wife, that he can change behaviors, unless that behavior change is coming from a change of heart, it's not going to really help. And so getting the heart in the right place. Men often feel a lot of shame and fear around sexuality, especially because so many of them associate it with pornography experiences that they've had. And it's something they might be very afraid of. And so letting them coordinate or align their hearts with their hands, making sure that what they're feeling is congruent with what they're doing, and accepting the fact that those sexual urges that he has are normal. The fact that he thinks of sex, I don't know what the percentage is. I read one time 29% more, or 29 times more often than a woman does. That's just part of his experience, and it's a good part.
And just to be open, I think, with our spouse to know what they're experiencing. Because I think sometimes we've internalized these perceptions of each other, and to really be able to ask those questions. How often do you think about sex? Like, what are you thinking about in this moment? I think is so helpful, because I know sometimes with my husband, I think he's thinking something all the time, and then when we actually talk about it, I'm like, oh, I was so wrong
Right.
about my perceptions. Being open with that. You mentioned emotional connection, which I think is a piece that is often left out of sexuality, which is like one of the most important parts
Right.
of creating this beautiful bond. If we're realizing, okay, like maybe before the sexual work, maybe there is a lot more emotional work. What are some tips for couples to get emotionally connected?
That's a great question. And I think for most couples, what can really help is reading good books together to help them. I love the book by Sue Johnson called Love Sense. Dr. Sue Johnson is really the founder of emotionally focused couples therapy. And she has this beautiful book called Love Sense. I think that John and Julie Gottman have a great book in the 7 Principles of Making Marriage Work. And the thing I really like about this Gottman book is that at the end of every chapter, they have little exercises for you to do together that you can really enhance the emotional connection by actually doing what they have in there. That's actually the textbook I use for my class at BYU on marriage enhancement. It's such a good resource. So find books, read them together, talk about what it is. If you need to reach out and there's maybe some real injuries that have gone on that you're not sure you can trust each other yet, reach out with a therapist and get a few sessions in and try to really break down that wall between the two of you so that you can have, I like to use the idea of breaking down a wall and building a bridge so that you're really crossing over into each other's hearts and being able to understand and help fulfill the emotional needs that they have.
I will definitely link those books that you mentioned in the show notes because I think that's so helpful to just have resources. And I know for me, that's one of the most important parts of sexual connection is to be able to, I can't remember what his name is. He's a preacher, but he mentioned this quote about like, when you undress emotionally, it also makes you want to undress physically. And I think that's so true.
Oh, that's
Like
beautiful.
when we can undress and just show who we are emotionally, our thoughts, our fears, our desires, everything, the way we've messed up, and take that emotional risk because a partner may not accept those parts of us. But when we can take that risk, and then there is acceptance and love and being able to see each other as we are, I think that's what creates this beautiful connection that we want in a relationship.
And in that dynamic, just the way you described it so perfectly, in that dynamic is where a ton of positive energy takes place. And both of you are getting needs met. Both of you are having emotional wants fulfilled. And you're able then to take that energy and pour it into life. And it just makes everything so much better.
Yeah, and re-energizes you in all these other parts of your life that
Right.
and talking about sexuality and about these deep emotional things can be so hard. I don't think we're practiced in it and we haven't had a lot of healthy models maybe in relationships in our family or in other families that we interacted with. And I know there's no one right way to start a conversation. And so, like you said, the most important thing is our hearts. But could you maybe just give some examples of ways to open up the conversation just to get people thinking of, oh, how would I want to open up this conversation about wanting to connect emotionally or wanting to talk about our sex life?
Well, I love what you just said. I think that I need to undress emotionally before I can really undress physically, something around those lines. That sends a real powerful message to your partner that I want to feel safe, emotionally safe with you. And in order for me to really show up sexually, this needs to be part of it. It needs to happen. And so, what are some ideas you have that we can use to undress emotionally, to help each other undress emotionally? I really think talking about emotions and trying to separate them from thoughts, this is really difficult for Americans. We just don't do it well at all, men and women alike. You can hear people talking, and I hear it all the time when they say, well, I feel like da 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 da. I feel like da 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 da. They're not talking about a feeling at all. They're saying a cognition when they say something like that. And so, what is it you're thinking? What is it you're feeling? And try to pull those apart so you can really identify I'm feeling scared. And when I feel scared, what I typically do, here's the thought part, is I withdraw from you. And so I need to be able to feel safe so that I don't feel scared anymore. And then talk about what's creating the emotion, what's creating that fear. Trust in a relationship, especially in a deep, abiding sexual relationship, love relationship. Trust is paramount for this emotional and sexual connection to be able to happen. And trust is earned pretty much in two ways. One, you do what you say you're going to do. And two, the emotional piece that you show up for me emotionally. And when I'm feeling something, you take the time to listen and try to understand what it is I'm feeling. So, building that trust with evidence and with emotional connection will really help you both undress, metaphorically, undress emotionally.
No, thank you. I'm so glad you brought trust in, which can be so hard because I think probably every relationship has had moments where trust has been broken because
Right.
we all mess up
We all
and
screw
make
up.
mistakes. So, what are some things that we can do to rebuild trust? Or if we're feeling in a place right now where, like, I don't trust my partner and I want to, what are some things to work on that a little more?
So, if it's a big betrayal, I think I would seek out and get some good help with a therapist. If it's littler things, I think talking about, what were you thinking in the moment when you chose to do that? Let's understand. And then how can we help slow down your response to thoughts like that? in therapy, there's a response gap. I don't know if you're familiar with that, where something emotionally happens or triggers you, and then you respond to it. The larger the gap is between whatever's emotionally triggering and how you respond, the more true you're going to be to responding the way you want to respond, right?
Mm.
So when emotional triggers happen, which happen to all of us, the more we can slow down our reaction to that trigger, the more true we're going to be to ourselves and the healthier the reaction is going to be. And so helping our spouses understand when they feel emotionally triggered, what are some things you can do to slow down that response? Because that's going to really build trust, because I see you working and trying to behave in a way that's more aligned with who you really want to be.
And I like that even in those moments where, speaking of little trust betrayals, like, oh, you said you would do this and it didn't happen. Those moments of hurt can be really emotionally bonding when you're able to talk through them and kind of see where the other person is coming from. And I think that's such a great thing to think about, just slowing down the response, being able to think and then being able to respond in the way you actually want to versus from the emotional trigger.
Can I tell you a quick story?
Yes, please.
Oh, my late husband and I, we were hosting a dinner party at our home at Christmas time. And he had a habit of continually running late. He was hardly ever home on time. And so I remember really telling him how important it was for me to have him be home on time the night that we were hosting this dinner party. And he needed to be home at 6:30. And he repeated it to me. He said he was going to be home at 6:30. So the dinner party comes 6:30, Mark's not home. 6:45, Mark's not home. And all of our friends are there. And so 7 o'clock, Mark's still not home. And so we just start eating without him. And around 7:15, 7:20, Mark gets home. And so in that amount of time, I've already made up all kinds of stories about why he's late.
Probably let the resentment start to build. That's what I would have done anyway.
Me too. I think, why didn't I ever think in that? I hope he's safe. But
Yeah,
that
right.
everything came to my mind. It was like, he doesn't respect me. Those kinds of stories were going on in my mind. And so he came home, we had the dinner party, everyone left, and immediately I did not respond nicely at all. I just responded with all my garbage and what I'd been thinking. And by the time I had vomited all that on him, I took a minute to take a breath. And he said, do you want to hear what I was doing, why I was late? And I said, sure, not believing it was going to be anything important. And he told me he had left on time. He had left work on time. It was raining. And as he was driving home, there was a woman that had a flat tire, and she was noticeably pregnant. And that he pulled off and changed her tire and got her all situated. And when he was done telling me the reason he was late, you can imagine how utterly ashamed and how bad it makes me cry even remembering it, because I would behave so horribly. And so I think to really build that emotional trust with each other, we have to be able to stop and slow down that response time to those knee-jerk reactions that all of us have for so many different reasons. Slow down the response time, and you're going to behave in ways that are so much better. And that's going to just build those bridges between the two of you.
Thank you so much for sharing that example. That is so powerful. I recently I needed to talk to someone about some things that we were thinking could go a little better in this organization. And I was talking to my husband about it, and he's very good at the slowing down part and very good at being like, well, maybe you could ask them first, like, what are your thoughts? What have you noticed? Instead of my reaction is to go in and be like, we need to change this and this isn't going well. And that conversation went completely differently because this person was able to share some of their concerns and the things they've noticed. And that conversation flowed so much better for then me to be able to be like, oh, and these are some things we've been thinking about, versus coming in ready to fight, kind of like your example. And I think this is so powerful in our partnership marriages, but also in other relationships outside to kind of take time to slow down. Thank you so much. That was seriously such a great example of that. Oh.
It's humbling. It shows. I hope I've grown up a lot since then. But I guess I share that because I want everyone to know that everyone behaves in ways they regret. Every one of us do at times, and we need to still work on developing ourselves and redeveloping trust in the relationship as we really try to slow down our knee-jerk reactions and live in a way that we're being congruent with who we want to be. We will be so much happier, and our marriages will be so much more rich and beautiful.
Oh, thank you. No, that was such a good example. As we're kind of wrapping up here a little bit, these conversations are so important to have outside of the bedroom, but I think sometimes transitioning them into the moments of intimacy and sex can even be a little more challenging, especially with a lot of the ways we've grown up. Like, you should just know what to do during sex to make it good. Like, you don't talk during sex. What are some tips that you have for us of creating that same safe space in sexual moments, to create a space to be able to share, oh, I don't like that, or can we try something new today, or just all these conversations? How can we create a safe space in the sexual moments of our lives?
That is such an important question. I think learning how to talk about sex with your partner in sex is something that is a lot of trial and error as you move through life together. So, a couple of ideas. One is to perhaps wait until if something hurts, that's different. I'm not talking about that, but I want to try something new. Probably it's not the best place to talk about that right as you're getting started. But I think it's so important in that resolution afterglow phase of lovemaking, where you can you've experienced something together. You can do a little bit of an evaluation, not like you're giving each other a grade, don't get me wrong, but kind of talk about what I really enjoyed when you did this just now. That was amazing. That kiss was so slow and perfect. Pick out the pieces that you really like, and then start talking about some things that you might like to try. I think that's a perfect time to bring those conversations up. Also, sometimes in the middle of sex, it's just a small touch of moving a hand or moving a head or positioning them just in a way that feels more pleasurable for you, rather than, saying something like, move to the left, or
stop that.
Right. You're hurting me. I don't know.
If they're hurting you, you definitely call that one.
Right. I totally agree. But I know that they're not meaning to hurt us.
Yes,
So
totally.
it needs to be a soft startup, everything soft, because this is such a vulnerable space. And when we are sharing this piece of ourselves with each other, when we feel like we're being criticized for what we're trying, it can damage some of the safety that you have there. And so I would make sure to do things very softly, and maybe just moving their body in a way that feels better, talking about it after you've already shared something really wonderful. To me, those are the healthiest ways to really bring about talking about the specifics about sex that you share together.
No, and I think even before you mentioned, like, oh, if I don't like something, I'll just move your hands like this to a place I want, and kind of calling it out beforehand so that those expectations are there. Like, oh, I know what he or she's doing in this moment, like why they touched me that way. I really appreciate that. And I think it's been so fun in my own experiences. I've tried to kind of overcome this stigma of not talking during sex. It's brought in some fun things where we can laugh, or, which wouldn't have happened before if it was like, we don't talk, like we never talk.
No, please do talk. Silence is not golden in the bedroom.
Yes.
Make sure you're communicating in a soft way, and timing is important, just as any other conversation. Soft startups, you're both eating. A good time to bring something up. So
no, awesome. This has been so great to have you on, Tammy. Thanks so much for joining me. Can you briefly tell our listeners where they can find you and some of your resources?
You bet. On Instagram, I'm Tammy, TAMMY _Hill, HILL _LMFT. That stands for Licensed Marriage and Family Therapist. On the web, I'm tammyhill.com. I have a newsletter that you can sign up and get a monthly listing of events that I'm doing. The Live Your Why podcast on Apple and Spotify is a podcast that I host. Those are probably the easiest ways to find me.
Awesome. And I'll link all those in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me, Tammy.
Thank you.
Was that not just the sweetest story ever about Tammy and her late husband? It definitely hit some heartstrings. And I think that was one of my biggest takeaways from this episode, was to give my spouse more room to make mistakes, more room to see them for who they are, and to listen when things aren't done the way that I want them to be done, to understand where they're coming from. And then, of course, just taking time to really allow my partner to see me as I am, and to also ask him questions to understand him, and to create a space where he can feel safe to show me who he really is. I hope that this episode gave you some good things to talk about with your partner, and to really take a chance to thank them for being there for you and creating a safe space where you can have more intimacy in your relationship. I hope that you enjoy your Thanksgiving. Thanks so much for talking love. Thank you to all of you who listen and join me on this journey, and to our Ladies Talking Love team who make the podcast possible. Thanks to our sound wizard, Kimberly Demers, our newsletter guru, Lauren Barton, and our miscellaneous task whiz, Jana Norman. As always, thanks for talking love.